Naoki Urasawa is my favorite Japanese author, pretty much full stop. I have very little hesitation to say that. I was first exposed to his work through Monster, which has remained one of my favorite shows since the first time I saw it. I still haven't finished some of his most popular works like 20th Century Boys, but I've at least never been let down by his work so far. So when an anime adaptation of Pluto was announced, I was excited for it, even if I didn't know anything about it. That said, I also haven't seen any of Naoki Urasawa's work in a few years, so I couldn't help but wonder if I'd really enjoy it as much as Monster, or if I'd even still enjoy his work the way I did almost a decade ago. Pluto is an adaptation of Naoki Urasawa's manga of the same name. It was published from 2003 to 2009. And while Pluto's length and setting are very different from his usual works, you can absolutely recognize his style. And I don't mean because of the noses. I mean, look at this guy. Look at this big old schnoz. The manga is essentially a loose adaptation of the greatest robot on Earth arc of Astro Boy, or Tetsuwan Adamu, written by Osamu Tezuka, one of the most well-known and influential mangaka of all time, and also a descendant of Hattori Hanzo? What the fuck? Osamu himself passed away in 1989, and years later his son Makoto Tezuka would go on to be a supervisor of Urasawa's adaptation, which essentially reimagines the original story to be from the POV of other characters and looked at it under a different lens, as well as adapting the original designs. I've seen a lot of people talking about Astro Boy because of this, and I'm glad it's a good manga, and I've seen several of the anime myself, though I tend to lean towards the 1980 anime as my preference over the classic 60s series by Yoshiyuki Tomino. I watched it when I was like 12 and it was incredibly upsetting. That said, I think a lot of people are also misremembering Astro Boy and treating Pluto as the dark and gritty reinterpretation. This ain't that old Astro Boy, this is dark and gritty. And while I love Pluto, I think it's disingenuous to act like the original series wasn't similar. It might have had a lighthearted presentation, but it still had that bite to it. All of the moral dilemmas and Astro or Adam being repeatedly traumatized at every opportunity was still there. Pluto just looks at it from a very different perspective, while giving its own takes on the same dilemmas. And I think part of what makes Pluto is so good is that it's not trying to be a dark and edgy remake. Instead, it comes from Urasawa's love of the original material while also giving his own views. Because as much as this is Astro Boy, at the same time, the entire show absolutely drips with Urasawa's style. My first time watching Pluto, it kind of felt like filling the void left behind by Monster when it ended. Every character feels like a very fleshed out person with their own difficulties and conflicting faults, all adding up to one coherent message and question that the show loosely does try to answer. The anime follows a robot detective named Dezit, who tries to solve a series of murders in which the most powerful robots in the world are suddenly being killed. It's a very well written and interesting murder mystery, though the strengths of Pluto generally lie in its character writing over that mystery, which is good because the mystery itself isn't really that satisfying, to be honest. I wouldn't say it's bad, but the conclusion of the actual mystery falls a bit flat. It really changes its focus pretty early on. Pretty much all of the best moments of the story are in regards to how it handles those characters, which are all very well written, with real depth and layers to them. I especially love the way it handles Adam's creator, Umataro Tenma, who despite having not a lot of screen time, ended up being genuinely my favorite character. So before I go further, I would recommend that you go into this show as blind as possible. It's 8 episodes, each one is an hour length, and it's on Netflix. Go watch it. Great show. I'm not going too deep into spoilers because I don't want to just recount the Wikipedia page for 20 minutes, but I'll talk about the themes of the story because I want to talk about it. It's really good. I've noticed that while watching Naoki Urasawa's shows that a lot of times he seems to set up a theme and then spend the story dissecting it to an extent. Monster particularly really handles this strongly. The titular monster and the question of whether or not all lives are equal is established almost immediately. It asks you, does the life of a man who funds a hospital have more value than that of a child? Can the value of a life be measured at all, or are they all just as equal regardless of actions? Does life have intrinsic value at all? Tenma chooses the life of a child who then grows up to become a killer. Does this mean he was wrong and that lives don't have equal value? Or was he right regardless? Monster spends its entire length taking those questions from the beginning, analyzing them, putting them under different lights, and then finally deciding on its answers. Pluto is a very similar idea, but instead of the value of life, it's about grief, loss, and cycles of hate. And at the same time, similar to his other works, it's surprisingly optimistic. It's a world of war and suffering, but at the same time, humanity isn't done. I've seen so much cyberpunk stuff lately that I was actually caught off guard seeing a sci-fi setting like this that isn't miserable. Despite the fact that terrible things happen, it's never portrayed as helpless or pessimistic. Cyberpunk settings are often about finding a form of reprieve in a doomed world and raging against that hopelessness. Well, on the other hand, the setting of Pluto is a surprisingly optimistic take on the future. A lot of current day struggles and societal issues remain, but things are slowly getting better in the setting, and I think at the end of the day that's something that I really enjoy about Urasawa's work. I especially remember thinking that when I was watching Monster. You see some horrible conditions and situations, but at the same time they keep that spark of life in them and a very earnest belief that despite everything, things can be good, characters can change. Adam particularly reminds me a lot of Tenma from Monster in this regard. He's got that same kind of genuine good nature and earnestness even once the story beats him down and drags him along. He's optimistic and kind, but not because he's naive. It's a conscious choice not to fall into the same hatred and bitterness that so many of the other characters exhibit. The robot Tutklut's clan was a little weird. That's a weird segue, but it's weird in the show too. In general, I think Pluto does a good job of handling prejudice in a multi-layered way, ranging from genuine vitriol to passive assumptions that weren't really meant badly. A lot of the racism towards machines is portrayed as ignorance rather than real hate. The Robo-Tay-Tay-Tay is a little bit jarring. It's like they suddenly pull out a sledgehammer when the subtlety was fine as is. That said, I still appreciate the idea. And besides that, I think Adolf is actually a very well-written character. It's a great portrayal of a genuinely good father and likable person who ended up swept up in a hate movement, only to end up recognizing what he had turned into by the end. It's strangely paced, but I overall did enjoy this plotline, even if it stands out a little compared to the, I would honestly say, almost perfect writing that the rest of the series holds up. In the end, Pluto is a genuinely amazing anime that I really did love all the way through, and I would give anything for more adaptations of Urasawa's works. Everything from the characters to the music to the realistic but still very appealing aesthetic of the animation is some of the best I've seen in a while. It is a legitimately beautiful anime with real passion and meaning behind it, where you can actually see the author in it. If you want to watch Pluto, all 8 episodes are over on Netflix. Give it a try. Thank you for watching.